The vast, desolate stretch of Nevada's desert was haunting enough at night. Miles upon miles of cracked earth, jagged rocks, and distant mountains, all shrouded in a dusty haze. But nothing in the world was as unsettling as the structure that loomed ahead, the Clown Motel. Dean and Claire had been driving for hours, their GPS struggling to find a signal in the emptiness. What was supposed to be a simple road trip to Las Vegas had turned into a nerve-wracking ordeal of wrong turns, endless desert, and fuel running dangerously low. They spotted the motel in the distance, its gaudy faded sign flickering through the encroaching darkness. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked, her eyes fixed on the brightly painted sign adorned with a cartoonish clown face. It grinned unnervingly, even from afar. "We don't have much of a choice," Dean replied, his voice strained with exhaustion. "We need a place to sleep and figure things out in the morning." As they pulled into the motel's gravel lot, dust kicked up around the car, settling slowly as they stepped out. The motel looked even worse up close. It was a single-story building painted in garish colors, reds, blues, and yellows now faded and chipped by the relentless desert sun. Clown figurines stood in front of every room, each in varying states of disrepair. Some had cracked faces, others missing eyes, yet all of them had that same frozen smile that seemed to follow them as they walked. "Welcome to the Clown Motel," a voice called out, breaking the eerie silence. Dean and Claire turned to see a man standing behind the check-in desk through the office's open door. He was in his late 50s, with wild gray hair and a smile that stretched unnervingly wide. "Got ourselves a couple of travelers, huh?" the man continued. "Name's Lou. You folks looking for a room?" Dean glanced at Claire, who gave a reluctant nod. "Yeah," he replied. "Just for one night." "Perfect," Lou said, handing them a key. "Room 6, you'll love it. Best view of the graveyard." Claire's eyes widened. "Graveyard?" Lou chuckled, the sound sending chills down their spines. "Yep. Old mining cemetery just out back, a real piece of history." He pointed to the window. Sure enough, in the distance behind the motel, they could see rows of headstones jutting out from the ground, their forms hazy in the twilight. Dean forced a smile. "Thanks," he said, taking the key and heading toward their room with Claire close behind. Room 6 was more unsettling than they had imagined. The walls were covered in faded clown-themed wallpaper, and various clown dolls sat on shelves in the bedside table. One particularly large doll sat in a corner chair, its eyes painted in a way that made it look almost alive. Claire shivered as she surveyed the room. "Why does it have to be clowns?" she muttered, feeling a creeping unease. Dean tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh. "It's just a theme, right? The place is old and creepy, but we'll be out of here tomorrow morning." They settled in, trying to ignore the clown's watchful eyes. As night fell, an eerie stillness enveloped the motel. Dean lay on the bed, flicking through TV channels, while Claire paced the room, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. "I'm going outside for a bit," she finally said, needing fresh air to clear her mind. Dean nodded absently, engrossed in a static-filled TV screen. Claire stepped out into the night, taking a deep breath. The desert stretched out before her, an endless sea of shadows and sand. She glanced back at the motel, feeling a twinge of unease as she noticed the clown figurines now cast in darkness. They seemed less like statues and more like sentinels. She wandered a little, her feet carrying her toward the cemetery behind the motel. The headstones stood like teeth in the earth, each one marked with names and dates from over a century ago. Claire felt a strange pull to walk among them, as if something or someone was calling to her. Back in the room, Dean was growing increasingly uncomfortable. The TV had turned to static, filling the room with its grating noise. He grabbed the remote and turned it off, but the silence that followed was even worse. The room seemed to close in on him, the clown's eyes glinting in the dim light. Then he heard it, a soft, childlike giggle. His heart skipped a beat. "Claire," he called, but there was no answer. The giggle came again, this time from the corner of the room where the large clown doll sat. Dean's stomach dropped. The doll was now facing him directly, its painted eyes staring straight into his. "No way," he muttered, getting up to inspect it. As he approached, the room grew colder, and he could see his breath misting in the air. Just as he reached out to touch the doll, its head turned on its own. Dean stumbled back, his scream catching in his throat. The doll's mouth opened, revealing rows of tiny, sharp teeth. It let out another giggle, but now the sound was distorted, echoing around the room. "Claire!" Dean shouted, rushing to the door. He yanked it open and ran outside, his heart hammering against his ribs. Claire was at the far end of the cemetery when she heard Dean's frantic cries. She turned to see him running toward her, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" she asked, panic rising in her chest. The clown!" he gasped, clutching her arm. It moved! It's not just a doll!" Claire felt the hairs on her neck stand up. She glanced back at the motel, and for a split second she thought she saw movement, figures slipping in and out of the shadows near the clown statues. "We need to get out of here," Dean said, his voice quivering. "Now!" But as they turned to head back to the car, a figure stepped out from behind one of the gravestones. It was Lou, the motel owner, but something was different. His eyes gleamed in the moonlight and his smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "You folks aren't leaving just yet," Lou said, his voice suddenly layered with a sinister echo. "The fun's just begun." Dean and Claire froze, their bodies numb with fear. From behind Lou, other figures began to emerge. Clowns. Some were small, hunched over, while others were tall and lanky, their faces twisted into expressions of manic glee. They moved slowly, shuffling forward, their eyes fixed on the couple. "Run!" Claire screamed, yanking Dean's arm. They sprinted toward the car, adrenaline propelling their legs as the clowns gave chase. The car loomed ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Dean fumbled for the keys as they reached the vehicle. His hands shook so violently that he dropped them. "No!" he cried, diving to the ground to scoop them up. Claire glanced back and screamed. The clowns were closer now, their faces contorted with otherworldly malice, eyes glowing in the moonlight. Finally, Dean managed to unlock the car. They threw themselves inside, slamming the door shut. Dean turned the key in the ignition, his heart pounding. Nothing. The engine sputtered but refused to start. Come on, he yelled, trying again. The clowns surrounded the car, their grinning faces pressed against the windows, leaving smears of blood-like residue as they giggled and tapped on the glass. Just as Dean was about to try the key one last time, the car's interior lights flickered and then the engine roared to life. "Yes!" he shouted, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, scattering the clowns as they sped out of the lot and onto the empty road. They didn't stop driving until they were miles away, the motel's garish sign a faint memory in the rearview mirror. Dean and Claire sat in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. "What the hell was that?" Dean finally gasped. "I don't know," Claire replied, her voice trembling. "But it wasn't just a motel." They continued driving in silence, the weight of what they had escaped settling over them like a shroud. It wasn't until they reached the nearest town that they dared to stop and catch their breath. The next day, Claire did some research. She learned that the Clown Motel was built near an old mining cemetery, the final resting place for dozens of miners who had died in accidents. The motel had changed owners many times, each one leaving under mysterious circumstances. Locals whispered of a curse, claiming that the clowns weren't just decorations. They were vessels, trapping the souls of those who died in the area. Dean and Claire never spoke of that night again, but they could never escape the haunting memory of the grinning faces pressing against their car windows. The Clown Motel remained, waiting for its next guests, its sign beckoning travelers like a beacon of false refuge. And those who stayed would learn the truth, that the clowns weren't there to entertain, they were there to claim.